She had nothing. No home. No name that anyone knew. No shoes on her feet. But on a cold Tuesday morning, she sat beside a little boy on the steps of a closed library and taught him something his father's billions never could. And that father was watching. Subscribe now. The next story will change the way you see people. Warren Cole woke up at 5 in the morning. Every morning. Not because he loved mornings, but because the world moved faster than most people realized, and Warren had spent his entire life making sure he was always one step ahead of it. His penthouse sat on the 43rd floor of a building he owned. The coffee was always ready before he reached the kitchen, because Dorothy, his housekeeper, had been making it at exactly 4:58 for 11 years. The car was always downstairs by 5:45. His schedule was printed, organized, and placed on his desk before he sat down. Everything in Warren Cole's life ran like a machine, quiet, efficient, and cold. What most people saw when they looked at Warren was a man who had built something remarkable. He had started with nothing, a small town, a single-room apartment, a mother who worked double shifts and still smiled when she came home. He remembered those years sometimes, in flashes, the way you remember a dream that's already fading. But somewhere between the first million and the 20th, something had shifted. He stopped remembering. He stopped feeling the weight of empty pockets, because he never had empty pockets anymore. And slowly, without even noticing it, he stopped feeling much of anything at all. His son Lucas was 8 years old. He had his mother's eyes, warm and curious, and always looking for something to hold on to. Lucas's mother had passed away when he was 3, and Warren had handled that the way he handled everything, by working harder, moving faster, filling the silence with noise and meetings and decisions. Lucas had Dorothy. Lucas had tutors. Lucas had a bedroom the size of most people's apartments, and a library full of books that no one ever opened. What Lucas did not have, in any real and present way, was his father. Lucas ate breakfast alone most mornings. He would sit at the long dining table with a bowl of cereal and watch the door, and sometimes Warren would walk through it, already in his coat, already on his phone, already somewhere else in his head. He would ruffle Lucas's hair on the way out, a gesture so automatic it had lost all its meaning. Lucas had stopped looking at the door after a while. He just ate his cereal and drew pictures in his notebook. He had been drawing the same picture for months, his father's face. He kept it in his school bag. On a Tuesday morning in late October, Patrick, Warren's driver, a quiet and loyal man who had worked for the Cole family for 6 years, was taking Lucas to school. The route was the same every day. But that morning, a water main had burst 2 blocks from the usual road, and traffic had folded in on itself the way it only does in cities, suddenly and completely. Patrick pulled the car to the side near an old public library that had been closed for renovation. The windows were boarded up, the steps were wide and gray, and sitting on those steps, with a worn notebook open across her knees, was a girl. She looked about 16. Her jacket was too thin for the weather, and her shoes had seen better days. Much better days. But she wasn't huddled or hiding. She was sitting upright, her finger moving slowly across the page, her lips moving just slightly, the way people do when they're reading something they really want to hold on to. She wasn't performing. She wasn't asking for anything. She was just learning. Lucas pressed his face against the car window. He asked Patrick if he could use the bathroom in a shop nearby. Patrick, who had a soft spot for the boy that he never admitted out loud, stepped out to check. And in that small window of time, Lucas opened the car door and walked across the pavement toward the girl on the steps. She looked up when she heard his footsteps. Most people, when they saw a child approaching them on the street, would either smile too wide or look away entirely. Nina did neither. She just looked at him, steady and calm. The way you look at someone when you've decided in advance that you're not going to be afraid. Lucas asked her what she was doing. She told him she was practicing multiplication. She showed him the page. She had written out a pattern. A shortcut, really, something she had figured out on her own after staring at numbers for long enough. She explained it to him in 3 sentences. Simple, clear, no extra words. Lucas stared at the page. Then he stared at her. Then he did the problem in his head, and got it right, and looked genuinely shocked, the way children do when they discover that something difficult is actually simple. He laughed. It was the kind of laugh that comes from somewhere real, not the polite, managed laughter of a child who has been around too many adults for too long. Nina smiled. Not a big smile, just the corner of her mouth, like she was allowing herself a small moment of happiness and didn't want to use too much of it at once. Patrick came back and found Lucas on the steps. He apologized quietly to the girl, gathered Lucas, and got back in the car. But all the way to school, Lucas was quiet in a different way than usual. Not the quiet of a child who has run out of things to say. The quiet of a child who is thinking very hard. He thought about her all day. He told his teacher about the girl who knew a math trick that no one had ever shown him. His teacher smiled and moved on to the next lesson. At home that evening, Lucas sat across from Dorothy and asked her, with the directness that only children can manage, why some people didn't have homes. Dorothy set down her dishcloth and answered him honestly and gently, the way she did everything. She told him that sometimes life doesn't give everyone the same start, and that the measure of a person was never where they slept, but how they treated the world while they were awake. Lucas nodded slowly. Then he asked Patrick if they could go back. Patrick took him back the next afternoon. He told himself he would mention it to Warren when the right moment came. He also told himself, quietly, that the right moment might take a little while to arrive. Nina was there. Same steps. Different book. This time it was a history book, thick and battered, with someone else's name written inside the front cover. She was reading about an old civilization, and when Lucas sat down beside her, she didn't skip a beat. She just started explaining what she'd read, the way a teacher does when they've been waiting for a student to arrive. She talked about how people had built cities without machines, how they had figured out irrigation and architecture using nothing but observation and patience. Lucas listened with his whole body, leaning forward, elbows on his knees, completely still. He had brought half his lunch, a sandwich, an apple, a small packet of crackers. He pushed them toward her without saying anything about it. She looked at the food for a moment. Then she took it, carefully, and said thank you in a voice that was very quiet and very sincere. They talked for almost an hour. Nina didn't share much about herself. She parceled out her story in small pieces, the way you do when you've learned that too much honesty too soon is a risk. But she told him that she had been on her own for about 6 months, that she had been separated from her grandmother during a shelter closure and hadn't been able to find her since, that she had found the library steps because she could feel the books through the door, and that made it feel less lonely. Lucas was quiet for a long time after she said that. Then he said, simply and without any awareness of how it sounded, that he had a library at home and nobody ever went in it. Nina looked at him. She didn't say anything, but something in her expression shifted, not with judgment, just with a kind of gentle understanding that was startling in someone so young. Patrick eventually told Warren. He sat in the front seat of the parked car outside the penthouse and delivered the information in a steady, factual way, preparing himself for the response. Warren's first reaction was exactly what Patrick had expected, sharp and controlled, but unmistakably angry. He talked about safety. He talked about liability. He called Carol, his PR manager, who was calm and immediate in her assessment. This was the kind of story that could go in a dozen different directions, and none of them were directions Warren needed right now. Warren thanked her and hung up. And then he did something that surprised even him. He got quiet. Not the quiet of a man who was finished thinking, the quiet of a man who was just starting to. He turned to Patrick and asked, without any of the sharpness from before, what exactly the girl had been teaching his son. Patrick told him. The math trick, the history lesson, the sandwich. The way Lucas had sat there, still and focused, for an hour. Lucas, who could not sit still through a 45-minute tutoring session to save his life. Warren said nothing for a long moment. Then he told Patrick to take him there the next day. No suit. Regular car. He parked down the road and watched from a distance. He saw Nina explain something in the history book, her finger tracing a line across the page. He saw Lucas get something wrong, and Nina correct him. Not with frustration, not with that faintly exhausted patience that tutors sometimes can't quite hide, but with genuine interest, like the wrong answer was just as useful as the right one. He saw Lucas laugh again, that real laugh. And then he saw Nina laugh too, properly this time, her head tilting back slightly, and it was so unguarded and so human that Warren felt something move in his chest that he didn't have a name for. He looked at her shoes, the hole at the toe, the jacket that was doing its best, but wasn't enough. The notebook that had been used so many times, the cover had separated from the spine and been taped back together. She had so little, and she was giving so freely. Warren had spent 20 years building walls between himself and the world, and here was a 16-year-old girl with a torn notebook, pouring herself out onto library steps for a child she had just met. He came back alone the next morning, before Lucas arrived. Nina looked up when she heard him coming, and her posture changed, careful, watchful, the stillness of someone who has learned that strangers arriving with purpose are rarely arriving with good news. Warren didn't lead with his name, or his money, or his plan. He asked her one question. He asked her how she had learned to teach like that. Nina studied him for a moment. Then she said that nobody had taught her. She said she just didn't have the option to give up. Warren felt those words land somewhere deep and specific. He told her who he was. She heard the name and didn't react the way people usually reacted. No shift in posture, no recalculation behind the eyes. What she reacted to was the second part, when he said he was Lucas's father. She asked immediately if Lucas was all right. That was the moment. Warren knew it even then, though he wouldn't be able to articulate it until much later. The first thing she asked about was his son. He told her he wanted to help her. She told him, politely and without apology, that she didn't want help. She wanted a fair chance. Warren went away and came back the next day with something different. He had spoken to a community education program that needed a junior assistant coordinator. It was entry-level. It paid a modest wage. She would earn every penny of it. He laid it out plainly, without making it sound like generosity, because she had made it clear that she didn't want it to be. Nina considered it carefully. She asked him why he was doing this, and Warren, who had spent 2 decades giving answers that were polished and strategic and always slightly off from the full truth, told her something honest. He said that his son had learned more from her in 3 afternoons than Warren had managed to teach him in 8 years. Nina accepted. Warren quietly used his resources, carefully, privately, to trace Nina's grandmother. Her name was Ruth, and she was in a care facility 2 counties away. She had suffered a minor stroke around the time of the shelter closure, and in the confusion and the paperwork and the chaos of the system, she and Nina had simply lost each other. Warren arranged a visit. No press, no cameras, just a car, and the 2 of them, and Lucas sitting in the back seat because he had asked to come, and Warren, for reasons he didn't fully examine, had said yes. The reunion between Nina and Ruth was not dramatic, in the way that reunions in stories sometimes are. It was quiet, Ruth held Nina's face in both hands and said her name twice, and Nina pressed her forehead against her grandmother's and closed her eyes. Lucas sat beside Ruth and held her hand without being asked, with the natural, uncomplicated tenderness of a child who has been lonely long enough to understand what it means to need someone close. Warren stood at the back of the room and watched his son, and he did not say a single word. But his face, for the first time in a very long time, was completely open. The welfare hearing was brief. Warren appeared not as Warren Cole the billionaire, but simply as a man who had something true to say. He told the judge that Nina had more wisdom and more genuine care for other people than most adults he had ever employed, and that she deserved a real chance, not the version of a chance that the system handed out by default. The judge granted Nina temporary guardianship with Ruth, with Warren's household listed as secondary support, while Ruth continued to recover. Carol sat in the back of the courtroom and watched the whole thing. Afterward, she didn't say a word about optics. That was how Warren knew it had mattered. 3 months passed. Things changed, not loudly, but in the way that real change usually happens, quietly and in small, steady increments. Nina was enrolled in an accelerated education program, and she moved through it the way she moved through everything, with focus, with hunger, with no interest in taking the long way around. Ruth was recovering. She and Nina had moved into a small assisted living apartment, and Nina was paying her share of the costs herself, from her earnings, exactly as she had insisted. She had accepted Warren's help as a loan. She had written the terms herself. Warren had signed them. Lucas was different now. He asked questions. Real questions. The kind that didn't have neat answers. He noticed people he used to walk past. He started carrying extra snacks in his school bag, and Dorothy pretended not to notice, and nobody mentioned it, and that was the right thing to do. Warren had started eating breakfast with Lucas every morning. He left his phone on the kitchen counter. He sat down. He listened. It sounds small. It was not small. One afternoon, Warren went back to the library steps alone. The renovation was finished, and the building had reopened. But he sat on the outside steps anyway, in the spot where Nina and Lucas used to sit, and he stayed there for a while. He thought about the man he had been on the morning all of this started, efficient, insulated, moving through the world without touching it. He thought about what it had cost him to be that man, and who had paid the price for it without ever being asked. He took out his phone, not to check his email. He called Lucas, just to talk. Lucas picked up on the second ring. He always picked up now. That detail, small and specific, was the one that Warren turned over in his mind, most often in the months that followed. A week later, a letter arrived on his desk, handwritten in a notebook page that had been carefully torn out and folded twice. Nina's handwriting was clear and deliberate, every letter placed with intention. She didn't thank him for the money, or the job, or the apartment, or the hearing. She thanked him for asking how she had learned, not what she needed. She wrote that no one had ever asked her how before, that everyone had always just decided what she was and moved forward from there, as if her own understanding of herself was the least important part of the equation. Warren read the letter once, then he read it again, then he folded it carefully and walked it to his desk drawer and placed it inside, next to something that had been sitting there for 3 weeks, a drawing on lined notebook paper, slightly crumpled, of a man in a coat. Beneath the figure, in the careful and optimistic handwriting of an 8-year-old, were 2 words: "My dad." Warren had found it in Lucas's school bag while looking for a permission slip. He hadn't said anything to Lucas about it. He had just carried it to his desk and put it somewhere safe, the way you do with something you're not ready to look at directly but can't bring yourself to put away. He stood at the desk for a long moment. Then he closed the drawer, went to the kitchen, and started learning how to make cereal the way Lucas liked it. It was a small thing. It was also everything. Some people spend their whole lives building higher walls, thinking that's what safety looks like. And then, one cold Tuesday morning, a girl with a torn notebook sits on some library steps and teaches a lonely little boy a math trick. And somewhere down the road, without anyone planning it or announcing it, the walls start coming down. Not because of the money, not because of the grand gesture, but because someone who had every reason to stop being generous chose, quietly and consistently, to keep giving. She had nothing, and she changed everything, because that's what happens when a person refuses, no matter what the world has handed them, to stop being fully, completely, irreversibly human. If this story moved something in you, if it reminded you of someone, or made you think about the walls you might be building yourself, share it with one person today. Not for the views, just because some stories deserve to keep moving. And if you want more stories like this one, stories that are real in the ways that matter, even when they're not, hit that subscribe button. There are more coming, and they're worth staying for.